Thanks for the lovely introduction, Steve. I really do appreciate it. I need to get my timer on here. Mr. Cook is a hard act to follow. Good morning. Success. We've all experienced it at some point in our lives. And while our definitions for what constitutes success may vary, I think you'd all agree it takes longer than 24 hours to become an overnight success. During the course of the dozens of interviews that I conducted for this brief talk this morning, I encountered success at every turn. Success forms a thread, a continual thread, a value chain throughout the bulk wine industry. And it begins, of course, with the producers. Because producers can grow and make saleable wine, by definition, they're successful, some degree or another. And in looking at the producer landscape, as we look at the value chain, from the supply side to the demand side, the producer landscape, what interests me the most here is how producers engage with the bulk wine industry. And I've looked at three different groups here: the as-needed or infrequent producer who engages, the specialist group. I was thrilled to encounter this group, folks that produce wine intentionally, specifically for the bulk market, and quite often for exclusively for contract suppliers, who Steve referenced earlier as contract manufacturers. Synonym, same thing. I call them suppliers. And then we have the hybrid group. And this is an interesting group. This is kind of the grower turned vintner group. This is the group that makes branded wine, but also sells wine into the bulk market. And when we look at where we might be able to anticipate growth, it's here. Because we have new channels emerging for access to bulk wine, we can see medium-sized producers, hybrid producers, having greater access to selling into the bulk market. Brokers, the broker landscape. Brokers are incredibly valuable in our industry, and I don't need to tell you that. Brokers provide a tremendous value add. The larger brokers, Ciati and Turrentine, they really empower us by sharing their real-time and historical analysis. We can work more confidently thanks to them. The broker landscape I've divided also into three groups, and the first being the niche brokers. Niche brokers specialize in a region or regions. They typically deal in high-quality wine, and they will procure lots of any size, right? They're happy to do that. Volume brokers, as the name implies, deal in volume. And you're not going to be calling them for 300 gallons of Sauvignon Blanc. So, the virtual brokers are the new and emerging category. Now, we've all seen online aggregated lists of bulk lots that are listed for sale or for call. We've seen that. But now we have the idea of a virtual aggregate, an online exchange that really does globally empower the industry. And let's look at briefly an example of a company called Vinaxe and how their model is successful. What we see with this idea of a virtual exchange is an increasing level of transparency. The bulk wine market has been sort of hidden. It's definitely hidden behind the branded wine market, and we are seeing more transparency now, and that's absolutely a good thing. For those of you who are not familiar with Vinaxe, it's a London-based exchange, and granted, the bulk wine market in London is far more mature than it is here. This London-based exchange, this is a look, a quick simplified look at their dashboard. It's a search that I've done for rosé. And I've searched rosé, and you can see I've got rosé available from 5 countries. The US, sorry, I'm going to need to look at my notes now. Oh my God, if I can remember them. So the US, Australia, South Africa, Romania, and the Ukraine. Ukraine, that was a new one for me. Okay, so we can see that there's an availability of both prices and availability of product. We have some on-call harvest forward offerings here as well too. So Vinaxe is basically providing, via their website, is basically providing not only currency exchange, but all the tools that are necessary for the analysis of working on the global bulk market. I found those tools right there at my fingertips, and I was really impressed with that. Dennis Hornibrook, who is the CEO and co-founder of Vinaxe, and this is not a commercial for Vinaxe, this is a way of understanding what they're trying to do, tells us that about 25% of the world's wine is traded in bulk. You know, that's a significant portion, but what's more important is that the industry has grown by 6% in the last 6 years, a very healthy 6%, and it shows no sign of slowing down. That is a healthy percentage of growth, and that's why we're here. Vinaxe is really enabling new medium-sized producers to access the market, and we see that transition happening currently. So the contract suppliers are contract manufacturers. As we move along the value chain from the supply side to the demand side, the contract suppliers kind of sit right in the middle. And they're a very key group. We have many contract suppliers represented here at the show. And their models are unique to each company, and they're also very successful. And I want to make sure that I get all of my points here for you because these are absolutely salient points. So these are companies that source bulk for the brands that they produce for others, yourselves, and for brands they produce themselves. The model that I've chosen to show you today to illustrate success is one of a company called WX Brands. And I don't know if the WX Brands folks are here, but I want to thank them for their time that they gave me for this talk. Now here's just a quick look at some of the brands that WX produces. They have 200 brands that they work with. They're based in Novato, California, and in London. And in a way, they're a hybrid of their own. They are a virtual exchange, but they do have feet on the ground in terms of regional managers. So the company founded by Peter Bick in 1909 started as Winery Exchange. Winery Exchange was one of the first virtual exchanges. It was a little before its time, and the company morphed into WX Brands. And what I'm going to show you is their path, their business path, and their path to success. So with global sales of $6 million, 80% of their business is producing private label brands. So that's a significant amount. Their products, as you can see, are sourced from 17 countries, and they're sold in 12. This is a company with a global footprint. What's happening with WX Brands I find very interesting, and it points to a trend in the contract supplying space, a trend toward fully vertical integration. WX started life based on human capital, really an asset-free model is what they called it, really focused on human capital, buying bulk wine. And then as scale and volume came into play, this was in 1999, over the next 10 years, things ramped up. They became very successful, and they began acquiring brands. They did so when they acquired their first brand, Echelon, from Diageo in 2011, not too long ago. They recently also bought the Jameson Ranch and the Bread and Butter brands, which we're going to look at a little more closely. So they've gone from buying bulk wine to acquiring brands. This year, they bought a bottling line. So now they're starting to have capital asset investment. And in response to the volume and scale of their business, they really have begun to lock in long-term supply contracts. They haven't resorted to buying vineyards yet, but they have locked in these long-term contracts to ensure that they have the supply that they need to feed these 200 some odd brands. I should mention too that WX is a beer, wine, and spirits contract supplier, so they're covering all the bases. Of course, we're interested in wine here. That's our interest, right? So I'm looking at Bread and Butter. This is a brand that they recently acquired, and it shows how they've scaled this brand very successfully. It's very successfully been scaled. They started working on it in 2013. 4 short years later, we see the growth demonstrated right here. This is very, very healthy. We look at the brand itself, we see almost what I'd call an absence of branding. This is very simple, very straightforward branding. This is not about branding. This is about volume, scale, and distribution. So the idea that quality and distribution really do account for the success of the Bread and Butter brand. Where is it sourced? It's sourced along the California coast and down in Monterey. The Chardonnay came from Carneros, go Carneros, and from Arroyo Canyon. The wines are priced at about $14, kind of line-priced wines at $14. So you can get a real sense of where this brand is at in the marketplace. So according to Dan Irving, Dan, if you're here, hi. Dan was one of my WSET students, brushing up on his analytical tasting. The way they've been able to really over-deliver for their clients and for their own brands is by navigating shortages in high-demand varieties. Cabernet Sauvignon is the key one that he pointed out. They've been able to insulate their customers from bumps in the bulk marketplace, and really that is very much the role of the contract supplier, to smooth things out. They've also kept a very, very sharp eye on quality. And as much as I would like to stand up here and talk about wine quality all day, I'd like to devote all my time to talking about wine quality. We're assuming that we're dealing with quality products here. We can make that assumption. So we've really got to focus on what else is driving this business. According to WX Brands company executives, premiumization is really a long-term trend that they see across all of their categories, and it is showing no signs of slowing. It's not slowing down. Here we are with the global negociant. And what is that? Well, let's talk about winemaker Dave Phinney. Dave Phinney is well known as the originator of the Prisoner brand and Orange Swift, two brands that he very successfully sold on and then have since been sold on, as a matter of fact. Phinney came up with the idea of Locations wine after he sold on his brands and bought a vineyard in Maury in Roussillon, France, where he lives part-time. Locations wine is his project. It's been around since 2010, so it's not brand spanking new, but it's a 50-50 collaboration with the Codorníu, the Spanish giant Codorníu Reventos. This is where the magic happens with Locations. Phinney basically is a disruptor. He set out to absolutely break all the rules with Locations wines. This is a non-vintage portfolio. He's blending wines across entire countries. You may think, oh, Frankenstein wine? Well, let's taste and find out. He's basically relieved consumers from dealing with vintage and terroir. Let's chuck that right out the window. So let's take a look at Spain. We're going to look at one of his wines, which is E. The branding here is a little bit cryptic. I was like, this branding is not the absence of branding, but it's rather cryptic. And the branding came from an inspiration from a license plate sticker he saw in France. So let's look at E. This wine is sourced from 5 regions in Spain. And if you follow from Rioja down, we can kind of circle Spain. It's Rioja, Priorat, Umilla, Toro, and Ribera del Duero. Yikes, all in one bottle. What is that going to taste like? Is it going to taste like Grenache or Tempranillo? It's hard to say. Well, the wine actually was very tasty. I've tasted all of the wines. SRP for this particular portfolio is $17. And again, you would think that branding was driving it. Oh, inside sources at Codorníu Revento tell me that the brand has now reached 100,000 cases. So I got that number directly from someone at Codorníu. So Phinney set out to emphasize old vines and terroir in his wines, but the wines really are a product of style. They are not a product of place for the most part. He's sourcing wines across 10 countries. At last count on his website, I saw 37 individual distributors for the US alone. And when I did a search for Locations wine within 25 miles of my home, this is what I saw. So he definitely has distribution and penetration with this brand. And that wouldn't be the case if consumers weren't purchasing it and there wasn't consumer adoption. Oh, retailers. Now we get to talk about retailers. This is really, we've now moved on to the demand side of the supply chain, for the most part. Retailers have their own unique proposition, and they're in this business for one reason. Retailers in the audience, thank you. You're here for margin, right? Retailers have lots of choices. They can work with the contract suppliers who offer them absolutely everything, from shiner programs to custom labels, you name it. We've got We've got contract producers like Terravant, who have they have Buellton-based Terravant in California, has a beautiful portfolio of Shiner program that many retailers are taking advantage of. And retailers are going directly to producers. We know this to be the case. An example that I'd like to share with you is actually the example of BevMo's program. BevMo's Vineyard Partners program was developed by then Cellar Master Wilfred Wong, who's a dear friend of mine. And it began with a project with Behringer in 2000. And according to Wilfred, it was very successful from 2000 to 2008. But when I asked him about which projects had the highest quality and the best margin for the company, he said those were the wines from Argentina and Chile. So he wasn't looking at his backyard for that margin necessarily. So here's a lineup of retailers we're all familiar with. Costco is the nation's largest seller of private label wine. We all know their Kirkland Signatures brand has done very well. And now Sam's Club, which is owned by Walmart, is finally getting into the act and creating a private label line under its Maker's Mark brand. So we'll have to taste those wines and see what they taste like. And I would really like to know who's helping them with that program so I can investigate further. And of course, we've heard a little bit in the news about King Estate, the Oregon Pinot Gris producer that's launched its next brand on Amazon. I'm familiar with King Estate. I've tasted a lot of their wines, and I was curious to take a look at their branding. And I just thought I'd show you what the next branding looks like. This branding is being sold exclusively through Amazon. And when I looked at the prices for their products, we've got Pinot Gris at $20, we've got a red blend at $30, and a Pinot Noir at $40. This is premiumization right in play. So private label program best practices, what we might want to look at in terms of how we ensure success for these programs. Their options for sourcing, we've touched on that. The contract suppliers can really help insulate the retailers from blips in the market. We know that margins are healthy, and that's why retailers spend the time doing it. But according to Wilfred Wong, these programs require support and maintenance. They require care and maintenance. Marketing is mandatory, and strategic buying and strategic inventory planning are absolutely essential for the success of these programs. So here's Eric Guerra at Terravant telling us that yes, there is attrition. These programs do come and go because they don't have the support that they need internally, and Eric sees this happening every day, or hopefully not every day, but he does see it happening. So programs run their course, and one thing I liked about Terravant when I was spending time on their website is that they clearly state their minimums for bulk wine orders and packaged wine orders. I loved that. If I wanted to know what I had to do to start, all I had to do was look at those minimums and I could have a starting point. I thought that was very transparent of them. I like this idea of transparency, and I really have focused on companies that are very transparent in this presentation. So we're winding down here. We've reached the tail end of our demand chain, and that is the wine directors or the on-premise folks. And yes, we're at risk for having some vanity projects here. We certainly are in vanity project territory. But what does a successful on-premise program look like? And thanks to Paul Einbund at the Morris, there's absolutely no risk of failure. Paul is a savvy, absolutely savvy producer, a savvy operator. Sorry, he's an operator. And he has an absolutely stellar track record. He knows his customers inside out. And his whole reason for engaging in these kinds of projects is that he wants to differentiate his offering. He wants to have something unique to offer his customers that no one else has. And they have followed him through all of his projects so they can taste wines that he's had a hand in creating. To quote Paul, he said, "Having something that's unique is a necessary point of differentiation in a competitive market like San Francisco. It's essential." He keeps a steady rotation of wines flowing through the Morris, and his customers are very happy about that. He moves about 20 to 40 cases of any one producer. That's 1 to 2 barrels depending. No problem moving that volume through. And it's really seen as a win-win by the winemakers as well. Winemakers love to work on special little projects and side projects. We know they do. They're always cooking up something special in the back. And Paul gets a hand in on that. So here's kind of quick success factors for for on-premise programs. So clearly operators are very motivated by their differentiation and by margin. Paul gets a great deal on those couple barrels and he passes that right along to his clientele. Lots of options for sourcing. In Paul's case, he's going directly to the winemaker. These are handshake deals, and they're really based on trust. And much of the bulk wine industry has been handshake business, right? But now that we've got the idea of virtual exchange, that's going to change a little bit. Trust is going to have to be extended. And there's a huge win-win value add for both the producer of the wine and the on-premise operator. So I'm going to give, my time is up. So I'm going to give Steve Frederickson-Turrentine the final word this morning, because I honestly believe what he said here. And prior to the research that I did for this presentation, I would have placed far more emphasis on branding, based on what I know about branding, based on the fact that I know if you change a label, you can up your case sales by tens of thousands, right? We've read those case studies, we know that. But we have to prioritize the factors for success in this scenario. And the way I've done that is by putting distribution right on top. Distribution followed by price and positioning, followed by quality and style, program support and management, and finally branding. So I'd like to thank you. I'd be happy to address any of the topics, any and all of the topics I presented this morning offline. But for answers, I'm going to direct you to the individuals and the organizations who are the experts in this field, and they're in the next room. So thanks very much.